most of our meetings were not easy meetings. This particular meeting was he was agreeing to everything I said. And I'm going, and the other thing was, when we met, almost every time we met, it was one-on-one. Because he was a performer. When he had his delegation in front of him, he would perform. Well, if he performed, then I'd have to perform in front of my delegation. So if this was about drama, that was great, but that's not what we were trying to do. But he insisted this day that we meet as a group. And I'm trying to figure out, he's saying yes, and he's saying yes in front of everybody. And I'm trying to figure out, what is going on? So finally, Jibril Raju, who was the head of preventive security of the Palestinians of the West Bank, said, you know, the chairman feels terrible about the article that was written about you. An article in the Palestinian press that it referred to me as Shiloh. And I hadn't seen it. And so I asked, I didn't know that was the first you heard about it. I said, what article are you talking about? So then he explained it. And so then Arafat says, yes, it's terrible, I apologize, shouldn't have happened. And Raju, who I said, head of preventive security, says, do you want me to call him in? Now, what he meant by calling him in was not calling him in. It was meant, shall we say, roughing him up. And I said, no, that's quite all right.
Let's take some questions for Alexis. Well, you know something? I know that at around, everybody's still engaged, having a good time? Would you let us go for a few more questions, or is there any record to still move along and sign books?
Yeah, happy to sign books.
All right, we got
ask questions.
Take one of these gentlemen. Sir, just give a brief, just trying to get as many as possible.
Can you elaborate a bit on what you're recommending regarding the Israeli settlement policy and what they should be doing to help prioritize that?
You hear the question?
No.
The question was, when I elaborate a little bit on what I'm saying about Israeli settlement policy. 80% of the Israeli settlers live within 5% of the West Bank, close to the Green Line. These are referred to as settlement blocks. And what I'm suggesting is that Israel, as a way to demonstrate that it means what it says about two states and two peoples, shouldn't be building in what is the Palestinian state. They should be building in what they think will be part of Israel. Now, the fact is, in the end, only a negotiation can produce a border that's agreed, but if you can't negotiate with the Palestinians, right now the Palestinians will not negotiate. So if you can't negotiate with the Palestinians, and yet you have a settlement policy that's feeding the delegitimization movement, allowing the BDS to disguise what its real purposes are, I'm saying, make it clear your settlement policy is consistent with your two-state policy. I would like the Israelis to announce they will no longer build in what they think is a Palestinian state. They will no longer build to the east of the security barrier. That means the security barrier is on about slightly over 8% of the West Bank. It means Israel would not build in 92% of the West Bank. And they would say, when we can negotiate a border with the Palestinians, we're prepared to do that. Until that time, we'll build to the west of the security barrier, which means we'll build in all the blocks. Now, the truth is, at 8%, you're getting about 85% of the settlers. So I'm saying, make your settlement policy consistent with your declarations on two states.
Should they dismantle existing settlements that cross over that line?
No, I wouldn't dismantle settlements. Look, settlements are a permanent status issue. So if the Palestinians want to come into negotiations, then you can talk about the future of settlements. For now, I'm saying you don't build to the east of the barrier. You build only within the existing blocks to the west of the barrier. What it allows you to do is say you are acting to make your settlement policy consistent with your declarations on two states. That's what I would do. Now, to be honest, I would say, I wouldn't just spring this. I would have a diplomatic strategy. I would go quietly to the Arabs and say, this is what we're going to do. Is there something you might do in response, or with the Palestinians? I would go to the Europeans and say, this is something we're prepared to do. What will you do in response? I would come to us and do the same thing. And I try to orchestrate a diplomatic campaign because you want to get some benefit for doing it.
So why don't they do it?
Well, because...
Sir, we have to move on. Sir. Anybody else in this section have a question? Okay. One more after the show with you, and then we're going to move on to the...
Ambassador Ross, nice seeing you again.
You too?
I don't know if you have followed what happened in Morocco actually this week. the King of Morocco has offered to change the whole Islamic education in all the schools. So all the basic education is going to be changed in Morocco. And in the last few months, he also has changed the formation of all the new imam and created also a woman brigade of imam. And it's becoming an example for all the Arab states. In addition, in the past few months,
What's your question?
yes, a group of Moroccan businessmen have traveled to Israel, and it seems like it could be, I don't know if you have anything to say in the book or not, about the relationship with Arabs, and Morocco is making a huge effort toward that.
Well, I do have a lot to say about the relationship with Arabs because, in a sense, in many ways, our approach to Israel was derivative of how we read the Arabs. So, the book, there's a chapter on every administration and what was guiding each administration, not just the key assumptions, but also what were the big issues, what were the big controversies or challenges within each administration as it related to the Middle East, and how did the administration respond?
But Morocco in particular.
Not really.
Sir?
Wouldn't we be far better off if Assad was in total control?
Wouldn't we be far better off in Israel and the United States and the region if Assad had remained in control of Syria and Gaddafi and Libya for that matter, and wasn't a huge mistake for the United States to basically undermine him and cause the civil war?
I mean, Gaddafi.
No, undermine Assad.
We don't undermine Assad. We didn't undermine Assad. The background, the facts are, in 2011, there were peaceful demonstrations, and he responded to peaceful demonstrations by killing demonstrators. And what did we do? We, after 6 months into this, the president said that he lost his legitimacy and we thought he should go. And the real problem was we staked out a position that was rhetorical, but we didn't back it with any means. And the question is this: would we have been better off if there was no civil war in Syria? Yeah, except that we weren't the ones who drove the civil war in Syria. How did we drive the civil war in Syria when he kills the demonstrators? That then produces an uprising. That's where it came from. We didn't promote the uprising. We did not. I mean, you look that way, but it's nice to know the facts. The facts are, they began demonstrations. He responded to, and the calls, by the way, were not for a revolution, they were for reform. He responds by imposing a war on his people. We refused to provide any lethal assistance. We didn't even provide any non-lethal assistance for a long time. I met, after I left the administration at the end of 2011, about a month after I left the administration, I met a 31-year-old lawyer from Homs, who was part of the Revolutionary Council of Homs. And he said it's a Muslim Brotherhood. At that time, the only Islamists who were there were the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, ISIS didn't exist. So he says, look, if the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power in place of Assad, if we get rid of Assad and the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power, we lost the revolution. But he said, we can't even get communication with the administration. The president was determined to avoid involvement in Syria. He did the minimum in Syria throughout. When he finally provides lethal assistance, basically in 2013, it's minimal. And it comes very late and in a very limited way. And his hope was first to avoid, then to contain. At every choice, at every step, he has basically done the minimum. Now, I wrote an article a couple weeks ago in Political where I said the president overlearned the lessons of Iraq. And not every situation means if we get involved, it becomes Iraq. We have the power to decide that. The bigger question you're raising is, is it in our interest to see authoritarian leaders removed if there's going to be a vacuum that replaces them? When there's a vacuum that replaces them, the worst possible forces fill it. That's a fact. But we have to look at, when the president was hesitant to become involved, he was hesitant to become involved because he looked at Syria and he saw Iraq. But if he looked at Syria and said, look, if I don't become involved, we're going to create a humanitarian catastrophe. Here we are, we're in a shul. There are nearly 12 million people who are displaced. 4 million who are refugees, 8 million who are living in conditions that are hard to imagine. We of all people, to be indifferent to a humanitarian catastrophe? I mean, for me, it's a very hard thing to swallow.
Any questions on this side of the room? 1, 2, and then we're going to conclude. Unless they're really short, in which case we try and get that lady back.
It depends on the answers.
Thank you. I was wondering what your opinion is of Russia being in Syria. Do you think they're becoming more powerful? Is it making things turn towards, are the other Arabs going to turn towards Russia? Because we are not there.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question was, what do I think of Russia's involvement in Syria? Will it make others in the region turn to Russia because we have...
Did you hear?
We've been as minimal in our response. I actually have an article in the LA Times today about this very issue, so you can read it online. Look, we're in a situation where the Russians agreed with Secretary Kerry on a set of principles for how to resolve Syria, which called for a set of principles were then embodied in a Security Council resolution a month ago. Negotiations were supposed to begin, accompanied by a ceasefire, a transition period of 18 months, and elections at the end of that. If the Russians had been serious about that, they would have imposed a ceasefire. The level of their bombing is such that if they said to Assad no more barrel bombs and you open up humanitarian corridors instead of carrying out starvation, Assad would have no choice. Instead, what the Russians did is they have dramatically escalated their bombings to support the regime. They're triggering a new wave of refugees from the north. And the very thing that supposedly they had agreed to, obviously, they're not carrying out at all. And there are no negotiations now. Part of the reason that Putin is doing it is because he wants to shore up Assad, he wants to preserve a Russian position in Syria, but he wants to show he's the arbiter of events there. He wants to show what he says. I mean, every time I talk to somebody from the region, they say the Russians tell us, you may not like what we're doing in support of Assad, but we stand by our friends, unlike the United States. And what he wants to create is an image that he's the power broker there, but not only Syria, anybody who wants to do anything in the region needs to turn to the Russians. That's what he's trying to create. Now, there's an irony right now. The Russian presence probably is a constraint on Hezbollah. It probably is. Because the Russians are no doubt telling the Iranians, because the Russians are providing air cover to Hezbollah on the ground. The real shock troops in the fight in Syria is not the Syrian military, which is down to about 20,000. The real shock troops are the Shia militias, Hezbollah and the Shia militias out of Iraq. And the Russians are flying air cover for them. So if the Russians say, you keep your focus here and not on Israel, they will keep their focus there and not on Israel. So Russia today is probably a constraint on what Hezbollah does. The question is, what happens over time? And Russia is trying to rewrite the rules of the Middle East right now. And they're trying to send a signal internationally that they will do things that reflect their interests, and they want to show the contrast between what we're doing and what they're doing.
Second question?
I find it interesting that the one topic that has not come up was the Iran nuclear deal. And my question to you is, number one, did you support it in the fashion in which it came out? And do you feel that the Netanyahu camp was right or wrong, or whether those who were in favor in Israel of the Iran nuclear deal were right or wrong?
First, you'll see when you read the Obama chapter, obviously I cover Iran in great detail because it's prominent in my role for the first 3 years I was sort of the leading conceptualizer of what we did on Iran. My position on the deal was the following, that there were good elements in the deal and there were concerns I had about the deal. If this deal is enforced, it buys you 15 years for real. Because The uranium enrichment pathway is blocked for 15 years. The covert pathway is blocked for 15 years because there's no way to create a covert supply of material because the supply, what's known as the supply chain, every link in that chain from mining uranium to milling it and turning it into yellow cake, taking the yellow cake and converting it into UF6, which is a gas, taking that UF6 and feeding it into a centrifuge. Every one of those links in that chain are covered 24/7, nonstop. So it's hard, you can't really squirrel away secret material for enrichment. And the plutonium separation pathway is blocked for 15 years. After 15 years, there are no limits. Which means, after 15 years, the Iranians get treated as if they're the Netherlands or Japan. Now, if in the next 15 years they become the Netherlands or Japan, this is going to look great. If after 15 years they're not the Netherlands or Japan, then what I was saying is we need to do more to bolster our deterrence, to create the equivalent of a firewall, so the Iranians aren't even tempted at the end of 15 years to think about trying to move from threshold status to weapon status. They forswear in the agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, ever seeking, pursuing, or acquiring nuclear weapons. But the President himself said this deal wasn't based on trust, it was based on verification. As I said, no, actually, it's not based on that, it's based on deterrence. That the Iranians know we'll catch them if they cheat doesn't matter. What matters is they know that if we catch them if they cheat, they're going to pay when they take price. And if, and I had 6 conditions that needed to be met to satisfy me, and they weren't met. Now, it doesn't mean I've given up on those conditions, because as I said, this deal as it's implemented buys you 15 years. What matters is what do you do with those 15 years? And we should be doing a lot to bolster deterrence, getting the world used to the idea that if the Iranians make a dash towards a weapon at any point, that means not sanctions at that point. It means we'll take out militarily their nuclear infrastructure. If they believe that, if the rest of the world accepts that's legitimate, which will add to their belief, then the deterrence will be real and we won't face that problem. But I still feel the need for us to bolster deterrence. I don't feel comfortable with what they're allowed to do after year 15.
So it's 9 o'clock, so we're going to stop there. First, I just wanted to thank you. Rabbi Weinblatt is going to go up and conclude for 1 second, but let me just add, first of all, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. I've read your book from cover to cover. I've read your previous book cover to cover and other books cover to cover. And I think that what you offered about the discussion of the bilateral relationship between U.S. and Israel is absolutely indispensable reading. And I think we're going to purchase a copy and send it to every member of Congress from our area, because they need to read this and to understand that when they're making decisions that they're not putting the U.S. Israel relationship at risk. Second of all, I want to thank you for joining us. I also thank you for devoting your life to going ahead and representing your country and going ahead and trying to bring peace to the region. And 3, for just being also at the same time being a proud son of the Jewish people. Thank you.
On behalf of Congregation B'nai Tzedek, we thank you all for coming, and especially Ambassador Ross, who was the first speaker in our David Isham Memorial Lecture Series. And to hear the way in which you have such a tremendous command, you truly serve our nation and our people and our world. And we are the beneficiaries. So I thank all of you for coming tonight, as well as Ambassador Ross. Please know. I once asked Ambassador Ross, how are things in the Middle East? In a word, he said good. I said, how about 2 words? He said, not good. Let's remind everyone that there's book signing taking place in the lobby, and if we could let the ambassador leave, that way we'll be able to be out there for us. So thank you.